Think when I say the word autism spectrum disorder? Well, I expect a fair number of you are thinking Rain Man. Well, I'm somebody with an autism spectrum disorder, and I certainly can't multiply huge numbers in my head. I can't play the piano from memory, and I really can't count cards. However, what I can do is negotiate life in this world with resilience and wisdom. So today I'm going to speak to you about the autism spectrum and wisdom and resilience. So I can guarantee that all of you, every single one of you, at some point in your life, be it now, in the past or in the future, will have come across a person or persons with an autism spectrum disorder. So what is an autism spectrum disorder? Well, it's a spectrum disorder, as the name suggests, and that means it covers a range of things, which include autism, high-functioning autism, and Asperger's syndrome. It's a lifelong condition. The causes are unknown, although there is a strong genetic link, and that is evidenced in many families where there are several people on the autism spectrum, including my own. So what does it mean? Well, autism is primarily a communication difficulty, so people typically have difficulties with non-verbal communication, like body language and facial expressions. We also have difficulties with meaning, so we only really understand the words that are said to us. We don't know if someone's lying to us or manipulating us. We tend to be, for that reason, very honest and very forthright. So I suppose another thing about the autism spectrum is that people on the spectrum have huge difficulties with sensory experiences. So we might be overwhelmed by sounds or tastes or smells, but it also might be positive. And I must say, the blue sparkles over there are really doing it for me. But another thing that we have that can actually be a real huge positive is that we tend to be passionate about a topic. And so often you'll find a university professor who's the world's foremost expert in some esoteric, rarefied piece of knowledge, and that person will be on the spectrum. But there's other things that are good about us in a work context, and this is one of my pet topics, so bear with me. We tend to be honest and loyal and hardworking and committed. We tend to focus in a huge degree and have great attention to detail. But there are some myths about people on the autism spectrum which I'd like to dispel. And one of those is that we don't have empathy. That's not true. We have a different kind of empathy, but we certainly have it. And I'm not going to talk about that today, it's just something to think about. Another thing that people often think people on the autism spectrum lack is a wish for socialisation, or that we don't want friends, apparently. Well, I've met hundreds of people on the autism spectrum in my travels, and every single one of us has wanted social contact. Certainly we like solitude and we like our own time, but we also want to be accepted, and sometimes find that difficult. For me, I got my Asperger's syndrome diagnosis when I was 20. And at the time, I didn't quite accept it for a few years later, but when I did accept it, it was a wonderful thing because it explained to me why my life had been like it was, why things had gone the way they had. So it was a great, liberating, empowering thing. But I suppose if I'm going to give you examples about resilience and wisdom, I need to talk about some people who are resilient and wise on the autism spectrum. And one such person is Professor Temple Grandin, who lives in the United States. Now, Temple is not only an expert in the field of autism, she's had an autism diagnosis since a very young age and has written several books and travels the world speaking. She is also the world's biggest expert in certain areas of animal behaviour and veterinary science, and that's what she's known for outside of the autism world. So she's somebody who's done incredibly well with the condition. And another example is Dr. Wendy Lawson. Now, Wendy lives here in Australia. We're very fortunate to have her. She received an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis in her 40s and has not looked back since. At last count, last time I checked, she'd written 10 books. My little one is not quite stacking up against those. But she also travels about the world talking about Asperger's, and she's an inspiration. She's also one of the nicest people I've ever met. I always say Wendy is the nicest person in the world because I've never met anyone nicer, so she's just a great success. Very accomplished lady. However, there's sort of a flip side to all this positivity, and that is people who aren't resilient. You know, people with an autism or an Asperger's diagnosis who aren't independent and don't manage in life. And the reason I'm giving this talk was due to one of those experiences. So, a couple of years ago, I met a young man, 19 years old, and he'd had an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis since he was 7. Now, this young man finished school in year 9 and had no intention of going back in any setting. He didn't want to do homeschooling, he didn't want to go to CIT or adult education. What kind of job can you get with a year 9 education now? Not really any, is it? That didn't matter though, because he went on the disability pension when he was 16, as soon as he was eligible. And for this young man, life was obviously going to be difficult. And the telling factor in this young man's story for me was when he told me he didn't have a licence, couldn't drive a car, but had never ridden on the bus at 19. So, extrapolating from that, this young man has been driven everywhere he's ever gone by a parent or friend of the family. So this young man really lacked in independence and resilience. So what is resilience? What am I talking about with resilience? Well, resilience is what you get if you push up against a problem and you keep pushing up and challenging that problem and trying to deal with it, and you come out the other side, and what you're left with is wisdom and understanding of that problem, which you can translate into other areas of your life. So how do young people on the autism spectrum get resilience? Because surely they need it more than most. It's very difficult for somebody with a disability in this world that we live in. Well, one thing you don't do is remove every single obstacle, every disappointment, every problem from that child's existence. Because if you do that, you will end up with someone who's dependent, like the young man I gave you an example of. What you do is as soon as they get that diagnosis, you see it as the chance to build in challenges, not horrible hardships that are going to cause them post-traumatic stress disorder, just controlled hardships, you know, things that they have to challenge themselves with and build their mastery and build their resilience. So another thing that you should do with children on the spectrum is not necessarily treat them as if they're all that different from their peers who aren't on the autism spectrum. Because I find, as a disability advocate, a lot of damage is being done by deficits, by teaching kids and by teaching adults, you can't do this. You know, you've got a disability, therefore you can't do this. That really doesn't help anybody. So it's really important to focus on strengths and skills and the good attributes that that child has rather than you have a disability, you can't do this. It's also very important with teenagers on the autism spectrum, and teenagers generally, I suspect, to set boundaries and limits. We spectrumites, auties, Aspies, whatever you like to call us, we thrive on rules, we thrive on boundaries because they help us make sense of the world. So if we don't have those, particularly as impressionable young people, we won't make sense of the world and it'll be very tricky. So for me, when I was a child, things were very different than they are for children on the autism spectrum now. So what are those differences? Well, for starters, there was no diagnosis of high-functioning autism or Asperger's when I was a child. I went through school with no assistance. There were no integration aids, there was no learning support units, nothing like that. Children now get a diagnosis at a young age. When they go to school, there's all that assistance, there's all those good things that'll make their lives better. So that's a huge difference. And there's more awareness in the community amongst people like you about disabilities and about autism more specifically, so that's a great thing. The best thing I think that's a difference is you hear about young kids now in primary schools and they'll be on the playground and one of them will say, oh, I've got ADHD, I take this medication. And another one will say, oh, I've got Asperger's, I have to do this. Oh, I've got dyslexia, I have to do this. When I was a kid, if you turned up at school and told your friends that you had a brain disorder and required medication for the rest of your life, they wouldn't have spoken to you until the end of year 12. So that's just wonderful. But obviously, as being somebody on the autism spectrum, undiagnosed, trying to navigate my way through life, I sort of had to overcome some obstacles. And I'll give you some examples of when I was resilient in my earlier life and my fairly recent life. So when I was 17, I finished school, I went to school early, and I decided to move out of home and get a job. Now that's quite a tricky thing for any teenager to do. and particularly a teenager on the autism spectrum. But it was compounded by the fact that there was a huge recession going on. It was 1992 when I left school, and that was one of the biggest recessions in living memory. And so youth unemployment was up here, and it was so hard to get a job, but I was determined to live independently. So I stuck at it. I went to 50 interviews, and I took the first job I could. So that was me being resilient. Another example was when I was at university. So I went to university when I was 27, and I loved it. I loved first year, I loved the work, I loved the information, I loved the people, I loved the stuff. Fantastic. Unfortunately, I have a mental health condition as well, and this flared up when I was at first year uni. I had to take the whole of the end of first year off and get special considerations and resit tests and things. It was horrible. And then when I went back in second year, I wasn't better. You know, mental health doesn't just go away. And so I had to deal with those issues of being unwell and going to uni, but I was so determined to get my bachelor's degree, and ended up being a master's degree, that I just stuck at it, and I thought, I don't care how unwell I feel, I need to do this. And I guess my last example of when I've been resilient recently would have been about 7 years ago when I moved to Canberra. So I used to live in Melbourne. All my friends were in Melbourne. I love Canberra, don't get me wrong, I love Canberra. I was offered a job in the federal public service as a graduate. Now, this meant the only job there was in this department was in Canberra, and I had to leave all my friends in Melbourne. I didn't know a single person in Canberra. In fact, the last time I'd been in Canberra was 1991, so it had changed a bit. But I was so determined to seize this opportunity with both hands. It was so important to me. Overcome disadvantage, move out of poverty, be an ordinary person with an ordinary job. These are all fantastic things. And those outweighed the difficulties of moving to a city to do a new job that I didn't know how to do, in a new city full of people I didn't know. I didn't care. I just stuck at it. So that was another example of my resilience. But I guess I've been talking about autism spectrum disorders, but presumably not all of you have an autism spectrum disorder, or are parents of someone who does. Maybe a few of you are neurotypical. Yeah, what I'd like to give you guys as an audience, and what I'd like to give the world if I could, is rethinking adversity. We need to rethink adversity. So basically, the way society views adversity and hardship at the moment is it's not fair, it's wrong, it's bad, it's completely bad. Bad things happen to good people, that's terrible. I view adversity a little bit differently. Certainly when something bad happens, I will acknowledge it and think I don't like this happening. But once I've done that, and once I've got a bit of distance from it, I look into it and I think, how am I going to turn this into a teacher? How am I going to get this to teach me to be a wiser, more resilient, better human being? How can I do that with this experience? And if we all thought like that, the world would be great. Another thing that I'd like you to think about is capability, and the capability of people with disabilities like autism. And the whole deficits-based approach, the whole saying, oh, you can't do this because you've got this disability, we need to turn that on its head. It doesn't help anyone. If anyone had told me that when I was younger, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you, and I'm enjoying it. I hope you guys are, but I'm glad I'm here. But the other thing we need to rethink is pity. You know, as a person with a disability and a mental illness, and I'm sure I'm not the only demographic group that experiences this, you meet people who seem to think they're in a better position than you, so they condescend to you, they're sad for you. It's absolutely infuriating. We are all human beings. What's the common thread of being a human being? It's hard. Everyone has something difficult to deal with. It might not be a disability, it might be poverty, it might be you hate your job, it might be you've got difficulties with your partner. All these things are barriers to achieving your full participation in the world. So it's really important just to view ourselves as all members of the human family, and we're all in it together. But what I'd like to summarise with and finish up with is talking about just the idea of children getting a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder when they're really young. Now, I think this is a great thing. I think it's really good. It's fantastic. However, it needs to come with a caution. It needs to come with a little warning label. Make sure you're giving these kids those lessons in being independent and being resilient and putting in those controlled challenges. That's vital. that resilience is a gift. A lot of people think, oh, we don't want people to have difficulties, that's terrible, we've got to shield them. You're actually doing them a disservice by shielding them from those problems. It's so important to build in those controlled difficulties to build that person's strength. And finally, to finish up on, people on the autism spectrum are amazing. We can do anything. We can do what people without autism do. We sometimes do it even better. So we're amazing. You're amazing. Thank you.